93 WIBC, WIBC.com. Love it when things like this are found, just when you think you know everything that you're supposed to know about history. Well, this particular thing we did know, but they didn't know it back in Franklin Roosevelt's day. It was kept a secret from the public, the fact that he had polio. And the Roosevelt administration, his aides, Secret Service, you name it, they went to great lengths to hide his handicap from the public. Well, there was some footage, some film footage that was recently discovered by a professor in the School of Journalism at Franklin College. He teaches public relations there. Professor Ray Begovich found this footage, which apparently is, as far as we know, the only known footage of what appears to be President Roosevelt in his wheelchair being pushed around. And Professor Begovich, who's been a very popular man ever since news of this discovery was made public by Franklin College, he's been good enough to join me here on 93 WIBC. Professor, how are you?
All right, good to be with you, Ray.
So this came about, as so many things do, by pure accident.
You're right. I was in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, searching for film footage of an Indiana native named Elmer Davis. Elmer Davis was a famous journalist,
reporter,
a novelist,
radio guy.
Absolutely. And he also, during the war, was the director of the Office of War Information. I knew he made a trip with President Roosevelt to Pearl Harbor. Elmer Davis was part of the president's traveling party, so I was looking through raw footage of that trip, hoping to find some footage of Elmer Davis. I did not, but stumbled across this incredible footage of the president being pushed in his wheelchair. It's only 8 seconds long. You can't see the wheelchair, but the motion clearly indicates that he is indeed being pushed in the wheelchair.
Yeah, if you have seen the footage, and we'll have it at WIBC.com accompanying this story, it's really unmistakable that it's the president being pushed by what appears to be an African-American gentleman down some sort of ramp.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And from other film footage and from still photographs of that day, you can clearly see that the president was wearing a light-colored suit, and he had on a white hat with a black band around it just above the brim. And so clearly the image we get of the side from the president's right side is of him in the attire he was wearing that day. The other fascinating thing, Ray, is that President Roosevelt was a tall man. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, and in the film footage, he is even though he's wearing a hat, his head is clearly much lower than the other people in the film, indicating that he was indeed.
Just amazing that this footage was out there, and as we all know, or as anybody knows who knows about President Roosevelt, they went beyond just about anything, or went to great lengths to keep the fact that he was using a wheelchair other than when he was standing up making speeches. They didn't want the public to know that.
No, they sure didn't. And this particular film footage is in the public domain. It's a raw film footage of a celebratory event, the president arriving at Pearl Harbor, which to me, the war was certainly not over, but the fact that the president was able to sail from San Diego to Pearl Harbor certainly meant that the United States Navy was well in control of things in that part of the Pacific. So to me, this is just accidental footage that was shot and just eventually donated to the National Archives. And I don't think there's any attempt to cover this up at all. They just didn't know about it.
Sure. Professor Ray Begovich is with us from Franklin College's Pulliam School of Journalism, talking about this footage that he accidentally discovered of President Franklin Roosevelt in the wheelchair, something that was kept secret from the American people at the time. To refresh everyone's memory, why did President Roosevelt himself, the people around him, why was it so important to them that the public not know that he suffered from polio, or at least did not see him suffer from those effects whenever he was in public?
Well, I think that's the key insight that we gained from this. It was a different time. the president did not want to appear weak. And the journalists of the day, the White House staff, the Secret Service, the president's family, they all fell in line with the president's wishes. These kind of silly stereotypes about someone who uses a wheelchair are and I believe should be pretty abhorrent to us today. But back in that time, it was looked at as a weakness, as a flaw. And personally, especially at this point in 1944, when we were winning the war, I think it would have been wonderful if Adolf Hitler knew that the man who was beating him used a wheelchair to get around.
We're just left to wonder what would have happened, what the thinking would have been among the general American public had footage like this gotten out, and let's say it showed up in a newsreel at a movie theater, which, again, it was a different time, different era. The media were a lot more cooperative with requests to censor certain material back then than they were now. So even if this footage had been out there and somebody knew it had existed, it's just as likely that nobody would have seen it back then.
Yeah, I think you're hitting it right on the button there. And again, this is a personal opinion, but I think if we had known, in 1944 and late in the president's life, that he used a wheelchair to get around, and that was public, and we were winning a war, and he had fought the Great Depression from that wheelchair as well. Let's not forget. I think it would have had enormous impact on our thinking about people with disabilities today. And one of my goals in making this public was to perhaps take a baby step toward that day when we do have people running for national office and winning national office who may use a wheelchair or who may need a guide dog or who may use sign language to communicate. So it's a personal hope that we get to that point someday where leadership, character, and policies matter and a wheelchair doesn't.
Since, I'll be honest, there'll be a lot more people curious about this than about good old Elmer Davis. As popular as Elmer Davis was back in his time, those couple of years he was on CBS before he went to work for the president. Did you ever find any footage of Elmer Davis that you were looking for?
No, not on this trip to Pearl Harbor, but there is some other film footage I have of him walking in and out of his office in Washington, D.C. Nothing very, very compelling, but there are amazing audio recordings still available of Elmer Davis, and he was noted for that, for the intelligence he brought to interpreting the news and to the ethics he brought to journalism, and for his down-home Indiana voice, which charmed people throughout the country. Another thing people don't know about Elmer Davis, he later worked for ABC Radio after the war, and he was a key component, or a key opponent of McCarthyism. And long before Edward R. Murrow essentially brought McCarthy down on national television.
Yeah, and I can't wait to read the biography of Elmer Davis because, again, this different era, and it's hard to get people in the frame of mind of what it was like to be in America at that time. Number one, why we would have thought that way about Franklin Roosevelt, as we were alluding to in his polio and whether or not he should be in a wheelchair, but just how big a deal Elmer Davis was because of the form of communication. There's no internet. There's no TV. You've got your daily newspapers, a lot of competition among the newspapers, and then you have radio coming of age just before war, and Elmer Davis among those great CBS reporters at the time who were in Europe describing the situation that led us into the war.
Yeah, and a lot of those people like Edward R. Murrow made the transition to television. But Elmer was too old for that, and so that's why we don't know him as well as we might know Murrow, Eric Sevareid, Walter Cronkite, those reporters from the World War II era who were in most of our people my age. I'm in my mid-50s. They were in our lives and in our living rooms on the TVs, even though they shared an era with Elmer, but he was older than them, and he died in 1958.
Can't wait to read more about Elmer, and of course we've got the footage of Franklin Roosevelt that you discovered while you were researching Elmer Davis. That's at WIBC.com. Professor Ray Begovich, Franklin College, it's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate your interest.